Across the frosted hills of Willow Ridge, Colorado, as dawn broke through the cottonwood trees, townsfolk paused to witness a sight that defied understanding: an old man walking 8 young German shepherds through the mist. No leashes, no words, just a quiet harmony between breath and paw. They moved like wind-drawn shadows around him, as if tied not by rope, but something deeper. And though many whispered theories, discipline, dominance, even cruelty, none could guess the truth. This was not training. This was healing. This was love, reborn in fur and firelight. Before we begin, do you believe dogs can sense our pain, even the parts we try to bury? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you. And if you believe every soul, no matter how wounded, deserves a second chance, tap that subscribe button. Because this story isn't just about dogs. It's about how one man's silence and 8 young hearts stitched a broken world back together. Morning in Willow Ridge crept in gently, like a secret whispered between the mountains and the sky. The town, nestled in a shallow basin of pine and cedar, stirred under a thin veil of mist as the sun filtered through the branches of old cottonwoods lining the edge of town. The air held the scent of thawed earth and chimney smoke. April still toyed with frost here, and the wind, though softer now, hadn't forgotten winter's bite. On Cedar Street, where the houses were older and the porches wide enough for rocking chairs and secrets, a figure emerged just past 6 a.m., like clockwork. Walter Jennings, age 50, moved with the quiet resolve of a man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He was tall but slightly stooped, with broad shoulders that had once borne the weight of burning roofs and broken bodies. His hair, mostly silver with remnants of dark chestnut, curled gently beneath a wool cap. A gray beard framed his square jaw, thick but trimmed with precision. He wore the same thing every morning: an old army green field coat, jeans dulled by years of wear, and sturdy brown boots dulled by red dust and time. His face bore no expression, but his eyes, icy blue with a hint of storm, held the kind of sadness that made people look twice but never ask. Flanking him were 8 German shepherd puppies, each only about 6 months old. They moved like a single body, a flowing organism of muscle and intent, paws clicking lightly on the wet pavement. No leashes, no commands, just presence. Each puppy was already large for its age, with growing limbs and deepening eyes, their coats a harmony of black and tan, with flecks of silver that shimmered in the morning light. They had names: Faith, Hope, Mercy, Valor, Grace, Noble, Joy, and Haven. But few in town knew that. To the townsfolk, they were simply the pack. Not one of them strayed, not one barked. Even when a passing car hissed by too close on Maple Avenue, or when a squirrel darted through the roadside grass, the puppies remained focused, their heads held high, ears perked, but calm. It was not obedience. It was something older, more sacred. It was trust. From behind lace curtains and fogged-up windows, the people of Willow Ridge watched. They didn't say much at first, but in small towns, silence is rarely empty, it brews. Whispers started at the bakery, where old Mrs. Cranston with her powder-blue apron tilted her head and muttered, "Strange, isn't it? No leash, no word." At the post office, Hank Miller, the former mailman turned bus driver, told stories of Walter from decades past, embellishing what little he knew. He used to be fire, now he's smoke. At the heart of that silence, in a small yellow house 3 doors down from Walter's, a boy named Mikey Thompson pressed his face against his bedroom window. Mikey was 10, all elbows and knobby knees, with a mess of sandy hair that refused to lie flat. He wore thick glasses that slipped down his nose when he got excited, and his front teeth had grown in too big for his still small face. There was a softness to Mikey, a gentleness that others mistook for weakness. At school, He was the one picked last for games, the one told to go play somewhere else when the others laughed too loud. But here, behind this window, Mikey had a secret. Every morning, without fail, he watched the old man and the dogs. He didn't understand why it filled him with something like hope. He only knew it made his chest feel tight in the best way. Mikey lived with his mother, Rachel Thompson, a single parent who worked as the librarian over at Willow Ridge Elementary. Rachel was tall and willowy, with quiet green eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. She had once dreamed of being a pianist, but gave up music after her husband left when Mikey was just a baby. Since then, life had become a checklist: bills, chores, lunch boxes, overdue books. She loved her son dearly but worried about him constantly. Mikey's fascination with their reclusive neighbor unsettled her. Walter Jennings wasn't a threat, not exactly. But he was an unknown, and in a town like Willow Ridge, unknowns were something to be managed. That morning, Mikey tugged his curtain aside as Walter and the puppies turned the corner toward the trail behind the woods. The sun struck their backs, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The dogs never looked at Mikey's window. They didn't have to. Mikey believed they knew he was there, especially the one with the white patch under its right eye joy. Though Mikey didn't know her name, he'd drawn her once, from memory, in a spiral notebook and wrote beside it, "The one who sees me." At school later that day, Mikey sat alone at lunch, his peanut butter sandwich untouched. The voices of other children came in waves, too loud, too fast. One boy flicked a grape across the table. Another called him Four Eyes. Mikey lowered his head and imagined walking beside Walter, silent and strong, surrounded by dogs who never judged, never laughed, just listened. That night, while Willow Ridge settled into quiet, Walter sat on his porch with the pups curled at his feet. He didn't talk. He never did. But inside him stirred something wordless, a shift, faint and slow. Because what no one in town knew, not Rachel, not Hank, not Mrs. Cranston, was that Walter Jennings hadn't walked alone in over a decade. Not until these 8 little hearts, abandoned at the edge of winter, had come clawing into his world and reminded him what it meant to breathe. And while the town whispered and wondered, while boys threw grapes and mothers worried, the old man and the dogs walked again the next morning. No leashes, no explanation, just steps, silent, steady, and seen by at least one boy through the glass, with eyes wide and a heart quietly learning how to follow. The wind had changed in Willow Ridge. It no longer carried the clean scent of pine and wood smoke alone, but now something more insidious: suspicion. By the second week of April, the soft thuds of Walter Jennings's boots and the synchronized padding of his 8 German Shepherd puppies had become less a curiosity and more a spectacle. Every morning at dawn, faces peeked from windows, camera phones hovered behind curtains, and conversations paused mid-sentence as the pack passed by. The man himself remained unchanged, stoic, silent, with eyes that barely flicked toward those watching. But the town was no longer just watching. It was judging. At the Willow Ridge General Store, behind the counter of homemade jam and honeyed soap, a woman named Clara Doyle leaned close to her friend, her voice low and full of drama. Clara was in her late 50s, round-faced and always wrapped in floral cardigans too heavy for the season. She was the type who believed every story had a darker version. "I saw him yesterday," she whispered. "Yank one of those pups by the scruff. Not hard, but enough to make it whimper." Her companion gasped softly. No one questioned whether it happened. In small towns, the truth didn't always matter, only the telling. By the time Sunday rolled around, the whispers had bloomed into rumors. At the church bake sale, Reverend McAllister, a thin man with silver glasses and a voice like wind chimes, overheard someone say, "He probably uses shock collars. That's why they follow him like that." Another replied, or worse. He barely speaks to anyone. You know what silence can hide. Even those who'd never seen Walter up close found themselves nodding, sucked into the echo of fear disguised as concern. Rachel Thompson, the town's quiet librarian and single mother to 10-year-old Mikey, sat at her kitchen table late one night reading a letter from the school. Mikey had been caught daydreaming during math, drawing pictures of dogs instead of solving equations. The paper was crumpled in her hand. She looked across the room where Mikey lay curled on the couch, a blanket pulled up to his chin, his glasses resting crooked on the coffee table. He was still so small, so inward. She worried about how much time he spent staring at that man and his dogs. Walter Jennings was, to her, a cipher no family, no words, and eyes that didn't blink at small talk. A man who walked animals without leashes was not necessarily someone she wanted her son fascinated by. Rachel stood, crossed the room, and gently brushed Mikey's hair from his face. In her 20s, she'd been the life of University Hall's blonde hair always braided, guitar in hand, quoting books, and laughing too loud. Then came the years of raising a child alone, trading chords for grocery lists, trading dreams for small survival. Her body had grown thinner with time, her cheekbones sharper, and her voice softer. Now, all she had left of that wild spirit was a deep ache for her son's safety. And this man, this Walter, threatened the one fragile world she'd managed to hold together. The next morning, after breakfast, she said, gently but firmly, I don't want you watching Mr. Jennings anymore, Mikey. Her son blinked behind his glasses. Why not? Because we don't know him, she said, and people are starting to say things. Mikey opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. There was something in his mother's voice he didn't recognize. Fear, maybe. Not loud fear, quiet, like water slipping under a door. Elsewhere in town, the watching had turned deliberate. A young couple, Tim and Marla Dawson, who ran the pet supply shop on Main Street, began timing their dog walks to intersect with Walter's route. Tim, tall and lean with a perpetual ball cap and a camera around his neck, crouched behind shrubs with his phone ready. If he jerks one of those pups again, I'm getting it on video, he muttered. Marla, softer and rounder, with a frown that rarely left her face, added, People need to see what's really going on. They never saw anything, of course, but that didn't matter. They posted vague concerns in the Willow Ridge Facebook group. Anyone else worried about the way those pups act? Too quiet, too controlled. Mikey noticed, even if his mother didn't. That afternoon, from the porch swing where he sat hugging his knees, he watched Tim crouch near the rose bushes 2 houses down as Walter passed by. The dogs didn't react. Not to the click of the camera, not to the movement in the trees, not to anything but Walter's footsteps. Mikey wanted to yell at Tim, tell him to leave them alone, but his voice stayed lodged in his throat, behind years of silence and swallowed comebacks. That evening, Walter fed the dogs as usual, 2 metal bowls each, spaced evenly across the porch. He had names for each of them, spoken rarely but with quiet reverence. Faith, hope, mercy, valor, grace, noble, joy, and Haven. Haven, the smallest of the litter, with one ear that still flopped while the others stood straight, nudged her bowl toward Walter when she finished. He knelt and scratched behind her ear. She made a low, contented noise and curled against his leg. From inside the yellow house next door, Mikey watched. He didn't draw them this time. He simply watched, chin resting on the windowsill. His heart felt tight again, but this time not in hope, in fear. He didn't know what grown-ups did when they were scared of something, but he had a bad feeling it wouldn't be quiet. The sky above Willow Ridge hung low with heavy clouds, pressing down on the rooftops and treetops with a kind of damp silence that made even the birds quieter. It had rained the night before, leaving the streets slick and the air thick with the scent of moss, wet bark, and asphalt. The morning light filtered through the mist in thin, pale beams, and across Cedar Street, the townspeople who usually watched from windows now waited with folded arms and unspoken anticipation. Parked in front of Walter Jennings's modest clapboard home was a white van with blue decals that read, "Rocky Mountain Animal Welfare Volunteers." It wasn't the police, but it was enough to draw curious eyes and hushed conversations. Walter stood on the porch, still in his olive field coat, the collar turned up against the chill, his boots damp with dew. His face gave away nothing. Behind him, the heads of 8 German shepherd pups appeared at the open doorway, peering out in various shades of curiosity and caution. The woman who stepped out of the van was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair pulled into a braid that ran down the back of her windbreaker. Her name was Reagan Miller. She wore jeans tucked into hiking boots and a fleece vest over a navy thermal. Her clipboard was thick with paperwork, but her eyes, soft hazel and quietly observant, betrayed no intent to cause harm. Reagan had spent most of her adult life working in shelters, both in cities and mountain towns, and had seen every shade of human cruelty. She didn't lead with accusation. She led with careful questions. "Mr. Jennings," she said with a respectful nod. "We've had a few concerns reported. Just want to take a look around, make sure the animals are healthy and safe." Walter didn't respond, not with words. He simply stepped aside and pushed the screen door open wider. No protest, no resentment, just quiet permission. Reagan exchanged a quick glance with the other 2 volunteers beside her, Mark, a thick-set man with kind eyes and a camera strapped across his chest, and Luann, a short woman with silver streaks in her ponytail and a clipboard that rivaled Reagan's. Both had been with her on more than a dozen inspections. They followed her up the steps cautiously, expecting tension, maybe even resistance. What they found inside was something else entirely. The house was small but warm, the kind of warmth not from temperature but from texture. Hardwood floors, polished but scratched by paws, faded rugs with dog toys scattered across them, and soft lamps casting a golden light over the room. The walls were lined with black and white photos, firefighter crews, old mountain landscapes, a younger Walter in uniform with a shepherd by his side. The air smelled faintly of cedar and boiled chicken. And the dogs. All 8 pups stood in a loose semicircle in the living room, alert but calm. Their eyes followed Reagan and the others, but none barked, growled, or backed away. One of them, the one with a white-tipped ear, Haven, stepped forward and sniffed Reagan's hand gently, then sat down as if giving approval. Reagan crouched beside her and smiled. "Well, hello there." The tour of the house revealed no cages, no chains, no signs of fear. Each dog had a small sleeping area, neatly arranged fleece beds lined along one wall, each with a name stitched above. But they clearly preferred the wide open floor near the fireplace, where a folded wool blanket and 2 larger dog beds sat beside a worn leather armchair. It was clear Walter didn't just house the dogs. He lived with them, ate with them, slept beside them. Mark took a few photos, mostly of the dogs lounging, one sprawled belly up on the rug. Luann noted the contents of the kitchen pantry: premium dog food, raw meat, supplements. In the back room, there were toys, brushes, and a first aid kit large enough for a small clinic. "You spend a lot of time with them," Reagan said, looking up from her notes. Walter, leaning against the doorframe with arms crossed, gave the faintest nod. "It shows," she added. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened just a little. Outside, the mist had begun to lift. The van's engine idled quietly, and a few neighbors, having lingered too long in their front yards, checking mail, slowly turned back toward their homes with expressions more thoughtful than before. Meanwhile, across the street, Behind a curtain in the small yellow house, Mikey Thompson stood on tiptoe, straining to see what was happening. He had heard the van earlier, had watched the uniformed volunteers walk up Walter's steps, and his heart had begun to pound in a way that made his stomach hurt. He didn't know exactly what they were there for, but he'd heard enough whispers over dinner, caught enough sidelong glances from grown-ups, to know it wasn't good. That night, after dinner, and after his mother had turned off the hallway light, Mikey sat on the edge of his bed, holding a folded piece of notebook paper. It was crumpled slightly from being in his hand all evening. On it, in small blocky letters, he had written, "I don't think you're a bad man. I think you love them, and they love you. Mikey," from across the street. He waited until nearly midnight, until his mother's breathing down the hall had settled into the soft rhythm of sleep, then slipped out the front door barefoot, shivering in his pajamas. He tiptoed across the damp lawn, past the rose bushes, and up the steps of Walter's porch. The house was dark. He slid the note gently under the doormat, careful not to wake the dogs inside, though he had the strange feeling they already knew he was there. He paused, looked toward the door, whispered, "Thank you," and ran back into the shadows. Inside, Walter sat in the dark with Haven's head resting on his knee. He had heard the soft patter of feet on his porch, felt the shift in the air. He didn't move, not yet, but something in his chest, long dormant, stirred. The clouds that had blanketed Willow Ridge for days finally broke apart, letting morning sunlight spill across the hills like gold syrup over an old quilt. The forest surrounding the town shimmered with leftover rain caught in the pine needles, and the air was damp with the earthy breath of new moss and thawing roots. From his front porch, Walter Jennings sat with a coffee mug in hand, and 8 German shepherd puppies sprawled around him in a semicircle of napping bodies. Their coats gleamed in the light, and their rhythmic breathing seemed to blend with the distant birdsong. It had been 4 days since the visit from the volunteers. Walter hadn't spoken a word during the inspection, but Reagan Miller had spoken plenty with her silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand, didn't pry, just observed, felt, and understood. Since then, Reagan had returned twice, not with paperwork, but with questions that sounded more like invitations. She had a way of easing into conversation, offering little stories about other dogs she'd worked with, or simply sitting and sipping her tea on the steps beside the pups like she'd always belonged there. Reagan was a paradox delicate in frame, yet firmly grounded. Her auburn braid fell over her left shoulder like a vine, and her freckles darkened in the sun. She had once lived in Boulder, worked in a high-rise office, but left that world behind after the death of her younger brother, who had suffered in silence until it was too late. Since then, she'd promised herself to listen deeply to anyone or anything that needed to be heard. Dogs had always spoken to her more clearly than most people. That morning, she arrived in her forest green Jeep, her boots dusted with red clay and her vest zipped up to the collar. She waved as she walked up the gravel path. "They waiting on me?" she asked, gesturing toward the now wagging puppies, who had all risen to their feet. Walter nodded once, his eyes shaded beneath the brim of his cap. They sat in quiet for a while, letting the sun warm the porch boards beneath them. Reagan glanced toward the yard, where Haven was wrestling with Joy, their paws a blur of play. Then she spoke, low and measured. "You know, Walter, you don't owe anyone an explanation, but stories, they carry light. Sometimes the only way to stop people from fearing the dark is to show them the lamp you've been carrying all along." Walter didn't answer, but he didn't retreat either, and that, Reagan knew, was something. Elsewhere in Willow Ridge, the school bell rang at 11:15 a.m., signaling recess. Mikey Thompson stepped onto the concrete playground with his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his red windbreaker. He kept close to the fence, head down. The other boys, rough and loud, swarmed the monkey bars and tetherball poles like a wild current. Mikey moved like driftwood among them. One of the larger kids, Travis Bowen, 12, always with scabbed knees and a cruel glint behind his grin, spotted him. "Hey, Mikey!" Travis shouted, his voice sharp. "You still drawing your little doggies? What's next? You gonna bark for us too?" Laughter erupted. Mikey turned away, cheeks flushed. "Leave me alone," he mumbled, but Travis followed. "Gonna run to your dogman friend? What's his name again? Creepy Jennings? Maybe he'll teach you how to heal." Mikey didn't respond. He bolted, through the gate, across the field, past the chain-link fence that bordered the schoolyard. No one followed. Most kids were too stunned, the teachers too slow. By the time the playground monitor blew her whistle, Mikey had already vanished into the tree line. The forest behind Willow Ridge was thick and old, with trails that twisted like veins. Mikey ran until the voices were just echoes, his lungs burning, his glasses fogged with sweat. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the lake. A still body of water framed by tall reeds and a broken wooden dock. Then he realized he didn't know how to get back. The sun had shifted behind the clouds again, and the forest seemed to breathe differently. Shadows lengthened. Mikey turned in a slow circle, the weight of the silence pressing on his chest. He called out once, twice, no answer. Back on Cedar Street, Walter stood beside Reagan, about to speak when one of the dogs, Valor, the most alert, lifted his head suddenly and growled. Then another and another. Within seconds, all 8 puppies were standing, ears forward, bodies taut with attention. Reagan tensed. "What is it?" Walter narrowed his eyes toward the woods. He didn't reply. Instead, he moved faster than Reagan had ever seen him. He stepped off the porch, whistled low, and the pack snapped into formation without hesitation. Reagan followed, uncertain, as Walter cut through the side yard and onto the trail leading toward the lake. By the time they reached the edge of the water, Mikey was sitting on the collapsed dock, hugging his knees, eyes wide with fear and embarrassment. When he saw Walter and the dogs emerge through the brush, he blinked hard, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Walter didn't say anything. He simply walked to the boy, knelt, and extended his hand. One of the pups. Mercy, a slender female with a darker face and gentle gait, pressed her nose into Mikey's side and licked his elbow softly. "I'm sorry," Mikey said, his voice cracking. Walter gave a slow nod, then reached into his coat pocket. From it, he pulled a folded piece of paper, Mikey's note, slightly smudged from the damp porch. He handed it back to the boy without a word. Mikey read the note again, this time with tears brimming in his eyes. Reagan stood back, arms folded, watching the quiet scene unfold. "This is what I meant," she murmured. "This is the story." The sun hovered low over Willow Ridge that evening, casting long golden rays through the pines like searchlights from heaven. The wind had picked up slightly, rattling the leaves and whispering through the trees with a voice that seemed both ancient and urgent. It was the kind of evening where even the deer held still, where something beneath the earth's surface felt unsettled. Word had spread quickly across town that Mikey Thompson, the quiet boy with the sketch pad and the wide, searching eyes, hadn't come home from school. Rachel Thompson, pale and trembling, stood on her porch, gripping the railing, eyes fixed toward the tree line. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her voice hoarse from calling. A search party had begun to form. Sheriff Dobson had been notified, and a few neighbors offered flashlights and nervous prayers. But it was Reagan Miller who made the first move that mattered. Reagan, still wearing her vest from earlier that day, had remained close to Walter's house, after witnessing the quiet rescue at the lake. When she heard the panic, Rachel's cries, the frantic shuffle of feet, she didn't hesitate. She ran up Walter's path without knocking. "It's Mikey," she said breathlessly. "They can't find him. He's somewhere in the woods again." Walter didn't blink. He turned and whistled sharply, one long note, steady and rising. The 8 German shepherds lifted their heads instantly. Their bodies straightened, ears flicked, eyes locked on him. He said a single word: "Find." Faith, the oldest in the litter by minutes, and the one with amber eyes that seemed to see beneath the surface of things, was the first to move. Noble, heavier-boned and broader-chested, with a deep bark that rarely echoed unless it mattered, was second. Together they sprinted ahead, noses to the wind. The others followed in a pattern like a living compass, scanning in waves, flanking the trees with precision beyond training. It was instinct bound by love. Regan kept pace beside Walter, her breath sharp but steady. The trail was rougher this time, narrower, laced with fallen limbs and patches of soft moss that muffled footsteps. As they pushed deeper into the trees, Walter moved like someone remembering rather than discovering. This forest, this hush, was not new to him. It had been 15 years since he'd last run through woods like these, not in Willow Ridge, but in Montana, where the fire had raged fast and blind. He'd lost his unit's tracker that day, a German shepherd named Brutus. Brutus had saved 3 lives before collapsing beneath a fallen beam. Walter had carried his body out, burned and weeping, the dog's collar clenched in his fist. Since then, he had vowed not to command another dog, not until now. Back in the woods, Faith veered right, tail stiff, nose twitching furiously. Noble followed, ears pinned. Walter slowed, sensing the shift. They were near. Through a break in the trees, the forest gave way to a clearing with a narrow drop, a rocky slope that tumbled into a dry creek bed. At the edge of it, wedged between 2 boulders, was Mikey. His red windbreaker was torn at the shoulder, and his legs were scraped, but he was conscious. Barely. His glasses hung broken around his neck, and his breaths came in short, uneven gasps. He wasn't crying, not anymore, just holding on, staring out into the dimming woods as if trying to will himself invisible. The first to reach him was Haven's smallest of the pack, but quickest. She whined softly and licked his face. Mikey blinked, dazed. Then he saw Walter, stepping into view from the shadow of the trees, followed by the rest of the pack like sentinels. "Stay still," Walter said gently, kneeling beside him. His voice was calm, low, one rarely used, but steady as a promise. He examined the boy's leg, bruised, possibly sprained. "You're okay now." Mikey's lip trembled. "I got scared," he whispered. "I know," Walter replied. "That's why we came." One by one, the dogs formed a circle around the two, sitting at even distances, eyes facing outward. They didn't bark. They didn't move. They simply watched, guarded, as if daring the dark to come closer. Regan arrived moments later, breathless but relieved. "Thank God," she exhaled. "We'll call it in." Walter didn't respond right away. He carefully lifted Mikey into his arms light as air and nodded toward the path they'd carved through the forest. "Lead us out," he told Regan. That night, back at the Thompson house, Rachel wept into her son's shoulders as he clutched the hem of her sweater. The sheriff, who had arrived too late to be useful, muttered something about filing a report. But it was Regan who faced the crowd that had gathered in the street. Her eyes were fierce, her voice louder than it had ever been in Willow Ridge. "Whatever you think about Walter Jennings," she said, "you can stop now. I saw him with my own eyes. He didn't save that boy with fear or force or tools. He saved him with trust, with love. And if you can't see that, then you're not looking." No one responded. But in the hush that followed, the mood shifted like the way cold breaks before the snow falls. It was a Tuesday morning, unlike any other Willow Ridge had seen in months. The frost on the window panes was melting faster now, and the first crocus buds had begun pushing up through the mulch in Mrs. Cranston's garden. Spring had finally made itself known. But it wasn't the weather that softened the mood across town. It was the change in how people spoke Walter Jennings's name. The man who had once been whispered about with suspicion and wariness now walked through the streets, greeted with nods and quiet thanks. He didn't smile, not fully, but he acknowledged them with a tilt of his head, and the 8 German shepherd puppies around him moved with the same gentle grace as always, no leashes, no commands, just trust. After the night Mikey was rescued, the town had shifted. Not instantly, but slowly. There were fewer stares, fewer muttered comments. At the general store, Hank Miller left out a sack of dog treats with a tag marked for Walter's pack. At the cafe, a woman named June Slight, and gray-haired with bright lipstick and a tendency to overshare, brought out a bowl of water for the dogs when Walter passed. Even Reverend McAllister mentioned him in Sunday service. Sometimes, he said, angels wear fur, and sometimes they walk beside a man who's learned to listen in silence. Reagan Miller had done more than just speak out that night, she had followed up. The very next day, she posted a letter on the town notice board, titled simply What I Saw, in which she described the night in the woods, the bravery of the dogs, and the quiet leadership of a man the town had judged without understanding. It spread through town like wildfire, and for the first time, Walter wasn't just seen, he was respected. Still, Walter remained quiet. He had spent most of his life letting actions speak louder than memory. But something about the boy, about Mikey, had stirred a dormant part of him. So when Rachel Thompson, visibly unsure, but polite, knocked on his door 2 days later, he stepped aside and invited her in. Rachel wore a soft blue sweater that matched the cautious tone in her voice. "Mikey, he wants to come by," she said. "Help with the dogs, if that's all right. He asked me to ask. I'll be nearby. I just thought you should know." Walter had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. So that Saturday morning, Mikey arrived in a flannel shirt too big for him, jeans with patches on the knees, and his glasses slipping again down his nose. He carried a small notebook, just in case he wanted to draw. But he didn't draw that day. Instead, he brushed dogs, filled water bowls, sat beside Haven and learned how to speak in silence. Walter showed him how to check their paws for splinters, how to clean their ears gently, how to earn trust not through words, but through patience. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice was low and firm, like the rustle of dry leaves on a calm day. "They don't follow me because they're told," he said. "They follow because they know I'd never leave them behind." That afternoon, as the sun slanted low through the pines, Mikey finally asked the question that had been in his heart for weeks. "Why do you have 8 dogs, all at once?" Walter sat back on the porch, a mug of tea between his hands. He looked toward the horizon for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "Long time ago," he said slowly. "I was a firefighter. Montana, back in '09. There was a factory blaze. Big, uncontrolled. One of my men was trapped inside. We had seconds, but I wasn't the one who found him." Mikey's eyes widened. Walter continued, eyes far away. "We had a K9 Brutus, big old German shepherd, smart, stubborn, wouldn't stop barking until we followed. He led me straight through the smoke, through debris, right to the man. Then the roof gave out." Walter paused. "Brutus pushed me clear, got pinned." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. "I carried him out," Walter said finally. "But it was too late. I lost more than just a dog that day. I lost the part of me that believed anything made sense anymore. For a long time after, I didn't speak much. didn't sleep much either. He looked down at the dogs now sprawled across the porch steps, Faith curled beside Noble, Grace resting her head on Joy's back. Then last winter, he said, I heard there was a litter abandoned upstate. 8 pups. Their mother didn't make it. And I thought, maybe this is how I give back. Not by saving people from fires, but by raising protectors, companions, lights for someone else's dark. Mikey said nothing, but his eyes glistened behind his glasses. Is that why you trained them like this? The boy asked. Walter looked at him then, really looked. I didn't train them, he said. I just listened. They taught me how. From that day on, Mikey came by every Saturday. Rachel would drop him off and linger nearby, sometimes sitting on a bench across the street reading a book, sometimes chatting with Reagan, who'd taken a liking to the boy's gentle nature. The town no longer whispered when Walter walked by. They greeted him, waved at the dogs, asked about their names. And sometimes, if you watched closely, you'd see Walter smile. Just a little. The breeze that rolled through Willow Ridge now carried laughter. Not the sharp, careless kind that echoed across schoolyards, but the soft, mending kind that rose from second chances. It began just past the bend of Cedar Street, behind the weathered white fence of what used to be an abandoned plot beside the old grain co-op. That land now bore a new sign, freshly painted with thick, simple letters. The Shepherd's Circle. A place to heal. Beneath it, 8 paw prints had been carefully stamped in green and gold. Walter stood at the gate with Reagan beside him, her arms crossed over a clipboard, a faint smudge of ink on her cheek. She wore jeans torn at the knees, hiking boots dusted with mulch, and a faded rescue and rehab hoodie pushed up at the sleeves. Her freckles seemed more pronounced in the afternoon sun, and there was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there weeks ago. Reagan had grown into something more than an advocate. She had become the bridge between isolation and belonging. The circle, as the kids called it, wasn't fancy. There was a matted training yard of soft bark chips, shaded benches, and a wooden shelter painted with murals of dogs and children. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in purpose. Twice a week, children from the town and nearby communities came to learn not just how to train dogs, but how to rebuild themselves. Each child had a story that wasn't spoken aloud, but could be felt in the way they held back when touched, or the way their voices cracked when laughing too hard. There was Noah, 11, with chestnut curls and a stutter that flared under pressure. His dad had left last year. There was Ellie Mae, 9, slender and pale with dark circles under her eyes. Her home had burned down the previous fall. And then there was Gracie, 13, tall for her age, guarded and sarcastic, her arms always folded tight over her chest. Her mother was in rehab. They didn't need explanations. What they needed were anchors. The dogs, now just over 10 months old, had grown into graceful adults. They still had the boundless energy of their puppyhood, but there was maturity in their eyes. Faith had become the quiet leader, always the first to approach a trembling hand. Noble, broad-chested and calm, let children lean against him without flinching. Mercy had an uncanny way of knowing when someone was about to cry, often resting her head on their lap before a tear ever fell. Haven, still the smallest, was always in motion nudging toys, stealing socks, making even the most guarded kids smile. Walter walked with his usual unhurried gait through the field, offering tips in his low, steady voice. "Let them come to you," he'd say. "Don't reach too fast. Trust has to land soft." The kids listened, not because he commanded authority, but because he didn't demand it. He earned it with every word he spared. Reagan, clipboard in hand, took attendance but never made it feel clinical. She kneeled beside Noah as he struggled to get Grace the shepherd to sit. "Maybe she senses you're nervous," she said. "Try breathing slower. She's watching your chest." Noah nodded, steadied his breath, and Grace lowered into a perfect sit. His eyes lit up like sunrise on a frost-covered morning. Later that afternoon, as the kids watered the pups and wiped down the benches, Reagan sat with Walter under the old oak that shaded the training yard. A breeze ruffled her braid as she opened her notebook. "You know," she began, "this doesn't have to stop here." Walter raised an eyebrow. "I've been talking to some people in Gunnison," she continued. "There's a therapy dog group at the VA clinic. They're interested in a workshop. Maybe a pilot program?" Walter looked down at Joy, who was curled at his feet, licking peanut butter off her nose from one of the kids' treats. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "This was never meant to grow. It was just supposed to help." Reagan nodded. "Helping tends to grow, whether you mean it to or not." There was silence between them, but not the heavy kind. It was thoughtful, open. "I'll think on it," Walter said eventually. "Long as it doesn't turn into some slick foundation with TV cameras." Reagan laughed, full and unguarded. "No TV, just people who need this, like the ones who already show up and don't say why." Across the field, Mikey was tossing a rubber ring for Noble, his voice louder now, more confident. He called the dog's name clearly, without stuttering. Gracie sat nearby, sketching quietly, her usual sarcasm forgotten for the moment. Walter watched them, the circle he never intended to build now pulsing with life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the last child waved goodbye from the back of a rusty station wagon, Walter lingered by the sign. He ran a hand along the rough wood and looked at the paw prints. "They're not mine," he murmured. "They are now," Reagan said from behind him. The spring morning arrived, as if it had been waiting patiently behind winter's shoulder, ready to stretch itself wide across Willow Ridge with golden light and soft warmth. The air smelled of lilacs and fresh-cut grass, the trees lining Main Street blooming with small pink blossoms that fluttered down like confetti. It was the kind of morning that asked for no permission, just presence. In the town square, folding chairs had been set out by the old fountain, and the bakery windows were strung with fresh bunting. There was no official event, no flyers or announcements, just a quiet message passed from neighbor to neighbor. "Walter is walking the dogs today. All of them. Through the square. Come if you'd like." And they came. Not in crowds, but in families. In twos and threes. People brought coffee and paper cups, dogs on leashes, babies in strollers. Old men with canes leaned forward in anticipation. Teenagers stood back, pretending not to care but filming anyway. And at the center of it all, waiting just at the edge of the cobbled walkway, stood Walter Jennings. He wore the same green field coat, though now it looked almost ceremonial in the sunlight. His shoulders were straighter, his eyes clearer. His silver hair, longer now, moved slightly in the breeze. Beside him stood Mikey Thompson. Not behind, not to the side, but beside. The boy was taller than he'd been that winter, his flannel replaced by a neat jacket, his glasses taped at the edge but clean. In his hand was a whistle, not for command, just for ceremony. He didn't need it. Then they came. 8 German shepherds stepped into the square, like a tide rolling in. No leashes, no words, just quiet rhythm and shared breath. Faith led, regal and slow, followed by Noble with his proud chest forward. Mercy moved close to Gracie, brushing briefly against the girl's hand as she waited with her sketch pad in her lap. Haven darted in and out along the edges, a playful guardian keeping the energy alive. Grace, Joy, Valor all in sync, as if each knew exactly where the other would be. And Willow Ridge responded. The crowd didn't cheer loudly. They didn't break into applause immediately. Instead, something more sacred happened. People rose. Children stood still, then slowly stepped forward. One by one, kids walked into the dog's path, not to test them, but to meet them, and the dogs paused for each. One laid its head in a toddler's lap. Another let a quiet boy with a bandage on his arm bury his fingers in its fur. A girl with braces and a camera captured a photo that would make the town's spring newsletter. Then the clapping started, not as noise but as gratitude, as understanding. At the far end of the square, beneath a sycamore tree heavy with new leaves, Reagan Miller leaned against the bench where she often took her coffee. Today, she wore a sundress under her denim jacket, her braid looped into a loose bun, and a faded clipboard resting on her lap but unused. She didn't speak as Walter approached, didn't need to. Their eyes met, and the smile they shared was the kind that belonged to people who had built something real together. Walter gave a slight nod as he passed. Reagan replied with one of her own. Behind them, the children now formed a kind of loose circle, moving with the dogs. Some followed Faith, others sat beside Noble. Mikey remained close to Walter, occasionally looking up with a grin that no longer carried apology, only pride. He reached out once and gently touched Walter's hand. Walter looked down and didn't move away. The town square that had once held its breath in suspicion now exhaled in welcome. The man they once whispered about had become the heartbeat of something bigger, a movement of compassion, of trust, of healing through fur and patience. When the walk came to an end, there were no speeches. Walter simply stopped, knelt among the dogs, and let them rest around him. The town did the same. No one needed more than that. And above them all, the morning sun rose a little higher, casting its light across every paw print left behind on the cobblestones. No leashes, no fences, just a man, a boy, and 8 lives once abandoned, now leading the way forward. Sometimes God doesn't send angels wrapped in light. He sends them in fur, with worn paws and names stitched into old collars. Sometimes they don't fly. They walk beside us through silence, through loss, through the spaces where words fail and presence matters more. Walter didn't set out to become a hero. Neither did 8 puppies once abandoned at the edge of winter. But together, they built a circle not out of stone, but of trust. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see someone walking alone, or a child sitting quietly with their pain, or a dog waiting patiently by a gate, you'll remember this story. You'll remember that healing doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it moves in step with a man who chose kindness over fear, in the gaze of a boy who finally believed he belonged, in the tail wag of a dog who waited for someone to listen. Because miracles don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they walk leashless through the square. Sometimes they sit beside a child in silence. Sometimes they grow from the ashes of what we thought we lost. If this story stirred something in your heart, please share it. Leave a comment below. Tell us about the animal who changed your life. Hit that subscribe button for more stories of quiet redemption, of second chances, of the love that walks on 4 legs and never asks for more than a place to belong. And as you go about your day, may God bless you and every soul you've ever held close, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Amen.